Okay, so this will be the first installment into what makes it snow in the Mid-Atlantic, things we want to look out for as far as it goes, and I am trying to do this on one take, so forgive me if I pause or seem awkward when I'm talking. It's just natural, it's going to happen. So what I'm going to try to cover here is what is going on in the atmosphere above, the things that actually will cause it to snow, and why that's so important and why we got to be looking for it, especially in our area. So we have a lot of things that mix into the region. I want to go over a little bit of map review because where we're on the Mid-Atlantic makes it unique as to why it will snow here and why it won't. And so it's important that I cover that. Common influencers on our winter storms. Now this is going to get into winter patterns and weather patterns and areas around our area of the North America that influence our weather in the most predominant way during winter. What I look at as our indicators, when I talk about speculation, if you ever look at Loudon weather or Mid-Atlantic weather and I talk about speculation, these are the things that I start to look for and speculate about long-term snow chances and whether or not we would see something. These are the patterns that influence that. And I'm not going to go over the specific phases of these patterns in this discussion now, but I will go into detail in a future recording because I think it's important for you to understand how all of them can help us or hurt us in their setup. And then I'm going to go over a typical look for winter weather into our area, what you're going to look for in the weather map. I mean, it's very basic, very simple. I'm going to go over the locations of systems that help us cause snow, so where the systems actually are. And I'm going to talk about the Millers, Miller A and Miller B. Obviously, Miller was a researcher, and he identified two different types of storm systems that affect the East Coast. There actually is a type C that I don't go over here. Type A and B are our typical things that we look for in winter weather. There are other things that will cause winter weather in our area, but these are the bigger ones that we'll look for. So hopefully that makes sense. So first of all, our atmosphere above us can have a lot of different things going on in it. And one of them is the temperature as it rises. In general, as you go up in elevation, you're going to get a colder set of air, just as a generic, sense. The higher you are, the colder it is. We know this. You go in the mountains, it's colder than in the valleys. That's typical. We do have things where things go in the reverse. And actually in the Mid-Atlantic area, it is something to really look at and think about it because we have the influences of things around us topography-wise. That's the overall with the mountains to our west, the ocean to our east, and the different areas that we have within our region are going to influence what's happening with the weather at the surface. And so it's good to understand what happens. This line here is the temperature from the environment. So it's looking at what happens with precipitation as it falls through different altitudes above. And if everything is what we call isothermic, meaning that it's from top to bottom, there's the same cold air, you're going to get snow to the ground. If it melts above us, and depending on where it melts, depends on what happens at the cold air at the surface. If it melts way above us or high enough above us, it will melt and then refreeze and we'll get sleet. Or it will melt and it will stay melted and hit us as frozen rain or freezing rain. Freezing rain is colder than 32 degrees often because it's been cooled, it's super cooled rain droplets. And then they hit the ground, they freeze instantly. It's probably the worst type of weather you can get because obviously there's no friction or anything on ice. Just to see that more representative, this is from the National Weather Service. And this shows that warm air, we call it a nose or intrusion of warm air. We saw this in the storm that recently happened in the Mid-Atlantic in December of 2020. A warm nose or warm air got into our environment way above the surface, and it did melt it and cause sleet, and then later freezing rain. So what you have is, yes, freezing rain if the layer of cold air is more shallow. If it's thicker, you're going to get into more of the sleet. And then, as I mentioned, if it's isothermic, meaning it's cold from top to bottom, you're going to get more likely to be snow. You can still get snow if you get slight melting up there. And I know people have seen this before. The snow pellets are what we call grapple or some of that nature, where it's like snow that's kind of refrozen a little bit and it looks like little snow pellets. That definitely happens as well. So we're looking for this in our periods of snowstorms, and we get these warm air intrusions a lot, and I'll explain why when we base it on the map. Where are we in the Mid-Atlantic? Well, we've got some really good things to help us out with the mountain range and we have the Atlantic Ocean as a big influencer on our weather. Where we are depends a lot on what is likely to happen weather-wise. Just look a little closer here, topography here in the Mid-Atlantic, the central Mid-Atlantic. You have different regions that are set up. You have the coastal plain, which this here, right along here, is called the fall line. Now, it is where during the last ice age, you had the continental shelf here that got formed by the oceans, scarring out and flattening basically ridges and things of that nature. And then when it starts to go up in elevation, that's called the fall line, because there are waterfalls all along here. They've been carving themselves further west, so you get things like Great Falls. But there are waterfalls along the bodies of water here because of the way the coastal plain is set up, and that is what the fall line is called. So that fall line is critical because, of course, as you get a little bit higher in elevation, you're going to get a little bit colder, and it's sometimes just that little bit colder that you need to go from a rain or mixed scenario into more pure snow, because you've got the colder air just because you're going up in elevation. Other things to influence in is the mountains. The mountains are very, very important in our region. It's good to know where they are, just as a overall kind of graphical representation here. You've got the coastal plain, as I mentioned. We have the Piedmont. Then we have the Blue Ridge, which is the mountains to the east here, the main part of the Appalachians. Blue Ridge, and then you get the Appalachian Mountains themselves. We get the valley and ridges. So all these things are very, very, very important to our weather, and they're going to influence a lot of what we see precipitation-wise. What I also didn't mention is globally, we are also in a mid-latitude. That's important. I mean, you go higher up in latitude, not by much. Get up into Pennsylvania, even upper parts of Maryland, and the climate changes pretty dramatically because of the amount of cold air that's able to penetrate down into the United States. Has a much easier time just north of the Maryland border, right into northern Maryland and northeast. So their snow is a different climate almost than we get here in northern Virginia, which is where I am. Or if you get into the southern part of Virginia, you get into a total different climate as well as far as snow goes and snow climates. And of course, you have differentiations between the East Coast, the coastal plain, and things that are actually further west. So all very important drivers. Now, why are these important drivers? Well, I think that one of the things you're going to hear a lot about is something called cold air damming. Now, I'm going to talk about this probably much more extensive in a future recording. But cold air does filter down oftentimes eastern part of the Appalachian Mountains from the north. I'll explain that as I show a map here later as to the influences of cold air from northern regions. But that cold air can then get deeper and deeper depending on where the high pressure systems are north of us. And that cold air getting trapped underneath the warmer layers above can cause a difference between, freezing rain, sleet, snow, depending on what's going on, or it can just cause really chilly conditions when it's raining, which we all know about. The dreaded 33 in rain is the thing that keeps on coming out many, many times. 33 degrees when it's raining and it's miserable. All these things influence our weather here, though, and they're very important things to note. Topography is a huge play in our weather. The next thing I'm going to talk about is a little more difficult to understand. I'm going to refer to this a lot over the entire time that I discuss it, and that is patterns or drivers of our weather patterns in the United States that are very, very, very important for snow. You possibly or probably heard about these influencers in winter patterns. I'm not going to get into El Nino and La Nina, which we can later, but really these are the big things that you look for in drivers for snow in the United States. And super duper important because they all influence the weather and where low pressure systems end up going, where high pressures sit to give us cold air, and everything of that nature that are so important. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the Arctic Oscillation. Now, this is the northernmost, right around the Arctic Circle, just as we mentioned. The Arctic Oscillation is just that area of cold air. It's the area way north at latitudes. And if it is in a negative state, meaning there's low pressure or lower pressure up there, then we have a much better chance that we're going to get colder air to filter down into the United States. If it is of a higher pressure, you get a positive Arctic Oscillation. We bring temperatures that are warmer because they come off the ocean areas, and it's just not good for us in getting snow. The North Atlantic Oscillation, NAO, is a very key component. You probably have heard of this if you've been in the weather world for a while. If the NAO goes negative, we're in better, more favorable scenarios because a negative NAO will block cold air along the East Coast and also slow down storm systems as they come into our area and help them to reform or condense and become much of a stronger storm system. These can slow down fast-moving storm systems, cause them to develop big coastal lows, and come up the East Coast and cause us snowstorms. So you definitely want, as a snow lover, a negative NAO. A positive NAO is very unlikely to cause a snowstorm and become an inhibiting factor towards snowstorms. It doesn't mean it can't snow, by the way, if you don't have a negative AO or a negative NAO. It just means more favorably if you get a negative one of these two oscillation pieces, then you're going to be in much, much favorable. So these are negatives. The positives, on the other hand, are your EPO, or the East Pacific Oscillation, and the Pacific North American Oscillation. These are the EPO and the PNA that you see in these. Both important indicator or influences on our weather. If the EPO, it becomes a ridge, so there's a high pressure there underneath Alaska, what it's going to do is it's going to force the air to go way up here and bring cold air from the Arctic regions down into the eastern part of the United States. You can have snow patterns driven by the EPO being in the negative phase, and that is very, very important to our weather. As well as a PNA, the Pacific North American. Again, if you can get a ridge here in the Pacific North America, so it's a positive NAO, positive EPO actually, you get those two to go positive, then you're going to get much colder air flooding into the eastern part of the United States. This is when you get the polar vortexes coming down into the United States because they're being pulled from the polar regions. There's always a polar vortex, by the way. If it gets split apart and little lobes or pieces come off, they come into the United States, we can get that. And when we get the PNA and the EPO to act together into a huge ridge off the west coast up into Alaska, we get what we call like the Siberian Express, meaning cold air coming all the way from the other part of the world in Russia across the poles, the North Pole, all the way down into the United States. That's when we get our super duper frigid weather that can happen. And in 2013-14, if you remember that big year, EPO drove that entire winter pretty much, because even though NAO and AO, the Arctic Oscillation and the North Atlantic Oscillation, were negative, we still were able to get a lot of snow because of those oscillations being in the right phase. So, all important factors. These are super duper duper important drivers, and I'm going to go over each one of them and the patterns that they form in a follow-up video. But I thought I'd just come out with this first video just to kind of say what's important for our region. In general, here's an easy look at a winter storm. This is one that was not too long ago, so I'll just obviously pull it out here. We have a high pressure system here in the northeastern part of Canada. Now, where this high sits is going to depend a lot on what's going on with our weather and whether or not we get snow, or we could get a mix or not, based on what the high pressure system is. You want to see high kind of pressure pushing in from this region for us to get a pure snow event. If this high gets too far east, it starts to bring in warmer air off the ocean. And although we may be cold and we get the colder air at the surface, that oceanic influence will actually cause a mix. It will also pull the low pressure system a little closer to us. When the low is closer to us, you can think of counterclockwise winds around here. It's going to bring warm ocean air and ocean water off that. Just a hint in general, if you look at the overall map, the ocean's a huge influence. And any air that's coming out the ocean, solely off the ocean, so an easterly wind, is going to start to drive the temperatures in the upper atmosphere up. And so we would not want to see a direct easterly wind off the ocean for snow unless you have a very strong high pressure system to the north. But when you get a high pressure system to the north, then your winds are no longer going to be purely east, they'll be northeast. So that's where you get the nor'easter. Northeasterly winds that come off the ocean are fine because by that point cold air is actually filtered in on the backside and actually giving us snow. So that's, I mean, this is very basic, so please know. Nor'easters are low pressure systems are coming off the East Coast. If you get too close to the low pressure system, it's going to bring warm Atlantic air into the upper atmosphere, turn us over to rain or a mix. If the high pressure system is further to the west, not too far, But further to the west, up there in northeastern Canada, you're going to get the colder air in place. It's going to lock into place and give us cold air east of the mountains. And when that happens, we get a better chance of snow. We also get that storm track further across the east coast. This last storm that came through the mid-Atlantic region, the low pressure system did not stay off the coast. It actually came on the coast. That's too close, especially this time of year. It's still climatologically too warm for us to see snow. So that's another thing that I haven't even talked about. But obviously we got winter months. Winter weather and winter cold really comes established in January, especially by the second part of January. Our typical winter weather time periods is the second week of January through the second week of February, when the cold airs really hit, about a month after the winter solstice, which happens on December 20th, 21st. So anyway, all right, so this is getting really, really long. So I want to talk about two things more. One is what you need in place for a good chance of a good winter storm and where lows will track. So I already mentioned this before, and I just want to highlight it. It's this high pressure system up here in Canada. You can have a high here all the way to here, and you're probably going to be okay as far as snow, as long as it's pressing cold in. If the high's way back here, you could potentially not get enough cold air. But realistically, if you get the high here and cold air pressing down around a clockwise flow, so you can imagine that you're going to get a clockwise flow around the system that's going to look something like in this direction, then you're going to get cold air from Canada down here along the east coast. Now, if you get the low pressure system, I'm in draw mode, but if I can get a low pressure system, yeah, that's when things don't work the way you want them to. But anyway, you get a low pressure system that can come along, and if it goes underneath this high and comes up the east coast, you're going to get moisture, you're going to get your snow systems. Many of our snow systems will do one of two things. They'll either start up in this direction, and then they'll reform off the east coast. And when they do, they will come up. Wow. Yeah, my graphics. A low pressure system will form along the coast and then move northeastward and bring in the cold air. The other ones will come out of the Gulf of Mexico and come up the east coast. And those will cause a lot of snow a lot of times. But these are the two different types of scenarios we see the most often. Well, low pressure system, remember, has counterclockwise winds, so it's bringing in moist air from the south and off the Atlantic and riding it up over top of the high pressure system that has got all that cold air at the surface. That high is there to bring out, to bring in the Canadian and the colder air and keep it in place. Now, if by chance its high pressure system is not anchored in place, as the cold air comes in, and as the low pressure system advances, the high pressure will move out of its way. And if that happens, then we turn over to rain. But if for some reason this high pressure system cannot move, so it has to stay here, then the cold air becomes locked in place, and then the low has to ride up around the weakness, which is usually to the right or further away from the high pressure system, and that brings snow. So there's a lot to take in. But what you're looking for, what I'm trying to bring emphasis on, is this locked-in high-pressure system, and the ability for it to stay in place is really by upstream what we call blocking. The most important feature, honestly, in East Coast snows are the negative NAO and what is called a 50-50. That's 50 degrees north, 50 degrees west, low-pressure system. The 50-50 low is critically key. It is the blocker that's in the place. If it gets trapped up there because you get the right setup, kind of a damming of the atmosphere, so they cannot move the low pressure system out of the way. The high pressure that's here cannot move where this is because the low is in the way. Then this low is forced to ride up underneath it and keep the cold air in place and cause us our snows. That is what you see in the best winter weather patterns. And you can even see that represented here. Here up to the north is this 50-50 low. That's what all these isobars are over here. Here's the high pressure system. It can't move out. So the low has to come off the coast. And sometimes they ride up closer to the coast or further out. It depends really on where this high pressure system is and how strong it is. So, but if this low as well can't keep moving east because it's got blocking as well. So all these things are important. But the key factor is that this NAO is negative. And it's actually causing a block, so the high pressure system cannot move out of the way, And then these low pressure systems are forced to ride underneath them, throw moisture over the cold air that is the high pressure system that's locked in place, and we get our snows along the East Coast. Now, I mentioned the two different types of scenarios that you can see with the low pressure systems. Some of them come out of the Gulf of Mexico. This is called a Miller A. So Miller did some some studies around these and the different types of setups. So the Miller A is a Gulf of Mexico low pressure system that does not reform. It just comes up along the East Coast. This is called a Miller A. It's our bigger snowstorms. You get huge snowstorms off Miller A's, but you can also get huge snowstorms off Miller B's. What happens in a Miller B is a low pressure system comes and it tries to ride into that block, that high pressure system up there in northeastern Canada, and it cannot do it. But there's energy, and it will transfer that energy to what's called a baroclinic zone. I know it's a lot of information, but a low pressure system will form along the East Coast. It will take over as the primary low pressure system and cause snow. Now, these Miller B's are more likely to cause heavy, heavy, big snows up in the Northeast than they are in the Mid-Atlantic, but we definitely get them. The most recent snowstorm in the Mid-Atlantic that we had was a Miller B. Now, where this low pressure to the west goes, it has a lot to play as to whether or not we get our rain or our snow or whatever mix. If it goes far enough south, we'll stay snow. If it goes north, as it gets too close to us, it can pull up warmer air in. So that's kind of what we dealt with in this last storm system, the low pressure system, the upper air, the upper level support, the energy was to our west, and it had not yet transferred all that energy to the coast. Until it transfers everything there, you don't have a good closed off cold source feeding the system. Instead, in the upper atmosphere, you have southerly winds. Because low pressure systems, remember, have a counterclockwise flow. So if the low is down here and it's got counterclockwise, no big deal because it's not going to be able to bring the warm air far enough north. But if the low is just to our west, it definitely can flood us in and cause us to go over to sleet, freezing rain, and things like that instead of snow. So what you want is the low to die off quickly and form the coastal sooner so that it starts to bring in the cold air from the north, which it did later. That's why we turned back over to sleet and snow in this last storm. Or you want the low to continue further to the south first before it transfers over. There are many times, too, where the low will come over here, and the energy will then transfer to the coast, and it will start to get its act together too far out of our way, and the bigger storm happens in New England. That happens a lot. And we can get into what we call like the dead zone between the energy transfers, and sometimes we think we're going to get snow and we don't. We've had some good examples of that. Boxing Day way back 2011, where we thought we were going to get a big snowstorm the day after Christmas and got nothing. I mean, it literally was sunny. We've had other experiences as well where we thought we were going to get snowstorms, and we missed them because the energy transfer happened too late. And so we got kind of until a lull or an area where we didn't get much snow at all. All that can happen, so it's things that we need to watch out for. All right, well, that was my first one. It was super long. It's about 24 minutes. And I know I didn't go to all the details, and I probably mentioned other terminology in there that made you go, what in the world? But I think you get the sense of kind of what causes our storms in the Mid-Atlantic. And now what I would tell you is I want to share every reason why we don't get snow. I'm not going to do it now, but I'll do it in a future edition. So hopefully you enjoyed that, and let me know. Give me feedback. Tell me what you want to know about. Ask me questions. And that's my first Mid-Atlantic weather snow overview.